Excellent. All right. So again, my apologies for the delay. Welcome to the Judicial Proceedings Committee. We're about to have a briefing on some of the strategies to combat gun violence in Baltimore City, and we're joined by a distinguished panel. So we'll start off. I'll just do a little brief intro, and then we'll start off with State's Attorney Bates. So we've got Ivan Bates, our the Baltimore City State's Attorney. We've got Commissioner Earl Harrison, Baltimore City Police Department. Shantae Jackson from the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood and Safety and Engagement, and then Dr. Webster from the Johns Hopkins University is joining us again. So without further ado, I know we're a little bit delayed. Mr. Bates, if you'd like to come up and do the presentation, we'll stand at the podium. We'll get started.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, members of the committee. It's an honor to be here before you today, testifying on behalf of the citizens of Baltimore City as we look for viable solutions to the violent crime epidemic that has continued to grow out of control across our great state over the past decade. Today is my first testimony before your committee, or any committee, the state's attorney for that matter, so I hope you're pretty easy on me today. The subject matter I've been invited to discuss today is an issue I know quite a bit about. We're talking about illegal firearms and or carrying or transporting firearms by those prohibited from owning such weapons. It's an issue that I ran on during my campaign and that I promised the residents of Baltimore City that I would be laser focused on prosecuting these crimes during my administration. And I'd like to keep those promises. Since 2015, Baltimore City has witnessed over 2,667 homicides through the end of last year. Of these tragic losses of life, we've noticed 2,340 of them were caused by firearms. That means 90% of all murders, homicides in Baltimore City over the past 8 years were due to someone with a gun using it as a tool to take someone else's life. That is why my main focus during this legislative session is simple. I'm looking at the penalty for illegal handguns. Maryland State Law PS 5-133D currently subjects an individual between age of 18 and 20 caught carrying or transporting or possessing a firearm to a 5-year maximum sentence and or a $10,000 fine for their first offense, whereas common law 4-203, where carry and transport an illegal handgun, allows for an individual 1 year older, 21 years of age, to only face a 3-year maximum sentence and or a $2,500 fine with only a 30-day minimum sentence. I'm looking to make the possession, transportation, and carrying a firearm a 5-year maximum across the board, aligning the penalties of PS 5-133D with that of common law 4-203, so that is uniform across the board for those 18 years of age and older, and offering a stiffer penalty for those considering possessing weapons in the city of Baltimore or across the state. Let me be clear about a couple things. One, this is not a mandatory minimum sentence, as some have tried to label it. Number two, as the prosecutor and judge still have the discretion to impose a sentence of up to a maximum penalty of 5 years. And second, this will not change the offense from being a misdemeanor. And that's important because a misdemeanor individual only has to serve 25% of the sentence. It will hopefully prevent many homicides from occurring across our city and state by increasing the penalty for those caught illegally carrying these dangerous weapons. For those of you who may ask why this change is necessary now, let me shed some light on Maryland Public Policy Institute report from July 2022. It looked at several factors surrounding the persistently high level of violence in Baltimore City, including studying the patterns of behaviors of those previously suspected of committing homicides. The theoretical basis for the study, how many Baltimore City murders could have been prevented by the criminal justice system before the murder even occurred. The study, which looked at 110 suspects of homicides occurring between January 2019 and July 2020, showed that 59% of those individuals who previously either committed a crime of violence with a weapon or got caught with that weapon in another crime. 62% had a prior weapon or firearm-related conviction, and 79% of those individuals would still have been incarcerated during the time of the homicide where they suspected of committing had they served their sentence. So the question shouldn't be why are we doing this now? Instead, we should ask others, can we afford not to do this now? People are dying rapidly in the metropolitan areas across the state, especially in the city I represent. We need an all-hands-on-deck approach to how we begin to strengthen laws and crack down on those who choose criminalization over civilization. We must decide that the risk of carrying a legal firearm is worth more than the reward of only receiving a slap on the wrist and a few months behind bars. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and consideration today. We continue this constructive dialogue throughout the 90-day legislative session and beyond, so we all seek the answers to help all of our communities. Thank you.
Excellent. So we'll take questions after each panelist. So we'll start off with questions from the committee for the state's attorney. We'll start off with Senator West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, in the last couple of years, we've had a bill that's been passed by this committee and then it's also been passed on the Senate floor, but has not made it through the House. And that bill would increase the penalty, would lengthen the penalty for a second conviction of using a gun to commit a violent crime. So the first time the person uses the gun and goes to jail, it would be the sentence provided in the law right now. The second time, once he gets out of jail, I assume it would be a he, gets out of jail and commits a second crime with a gun, the sentence would be considerably longer. What is your position on that concept, if not the exact language of the bill?
Well, I know there are some laws in the book, for instance, if an individual already has a felony and now they have a handgun, yes, you can file, there are minimum mandatories that you can ask for to file without being a felon in possession up to 15 years. So I look at it from that standpoint, but also look at it from your standpoint. I do think there needs to be a little more deterrent. I'm not opposed to that. I would need to know a little bit more about it in terms of actually what we're looking at.
Right.
I don't necessarily like the mandatory minimum because I want the prosecutor to be able and the court to be able to have the ability, because not everybody deserves a mandatory minimum. Right. However, if you do find an individual, say for instance they've had 4 or 5 illegal handgun charges and they've won every single one, and then they're convicted of one, then they come back a second or a third time. What I know, a lot of times I also look at not only being a state's attorney, the state's attorney, but also the criminal defense attorney for 20 years. So I can tell you the mentality is the more you do it and they aren't held accountable, meaning the criminal element, the more they feel emboldened and continue to do it. Right. So from that standpoint, I think you do have to go ahead and hold people accountable.
Thanks very much.
Senator Carter, then Senator Folden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Mr. State's Attorney and the rest of the panel. Because the chairman said that we should ask questions after each panelist, I'll put my question now, but it's really going to also, to some extent, involve Commissioner Harrison. In considering this, and we've talked offline, but any concerns I have revolves primarily around the fact that there are many variables in the crime of possession of an illegal gun. And those variables are everything from the difference between constructive and actual possession, as well as different circumstances surrounding it. You know, there's different when there's just, you know, as they throw the gun in with every felony, if there's any gun is in the vicinity and there's any felony committed, then it's associated with it, versus someone that, you know, has a gun in the home that's illegal gun. So there are different variables, and I understand that the courts have discretion. I don't know that the proposed measure is one of the right ones, but this is where my question that maybe Commissioner Harrison can think about really comes in. I spoke just last night, and I've been talking about it for years, that too often we attack guns and gun crime in much of the ill-advised ways that we attacked the drug problem, where we initially went after individual possessors and individual possessors with intent to distribute, but we never really dealt with the large volume dealers, the large volume traffickers. And my concern is that our city and our state and our country and our world is inundated right now with guns. Guns are so easy. I've never seen guns this accessible as I have in the last few years. I'm concerned that we aren't attacking the problem at the highest levels, which is how these guns are getting into the city anyway. So that's why, Commissioner Harrison, you're not up yet, but I wanted you to think about that, because what I think is that a smarter way to address this, even if we consider your proposal, Mr. Bates, is to also consider what we are doing in terms of when we arrest the little guy on the street with the gun that may not, and usually isn't, in the act of committing a violent crime, when we arrest them, what are our efforts in tracking how they came into possession of the gun, tracking the original sources, tracking those times where there's a difference between an original source that comes from the city versus out of the city, original source that comes from an arms dealer that initially had the guns legally. I heard an earlier panelist talk about theft of guns not being checked. My question is really that, you know, we're still talking like small potatoes. We talk about an individual whose gun is stolen versus a dealer or a major, you know, arms person or company that has mass volumes of guns that are somehow not accounted for. And so my question is, I suppose since I have to end with one, is what consideration is your office giving to that, and how are you working with other partners to go after those large volume dealers that are responsible for the mass numbers of guns on our streets? And then also when the commissioner comes up, I'd like to know what efforts are being made for that too.
Well, this is what I'll say. When I been in job 2 weeks today, but in my inauguration speech, one of the things I talked about is if an individual is going to sell guns and manufacture guns, we're not going to offer plea bargains. We want to go to trial, and we want to hold them accountable to a severe, stiff penalty. I think that's something that needs to do because that is a major, major, major deterrent. We'll also work very closely with the federal government to make sure these individuals that are bringing these guns can also be prosecuted in the federal system because there are different laws and have different penalties. So I agree that we must really focus on them, the individual bringing guns into this, the community. But what I also know is that before Freddie Gray, a lot of individuals weren't carrying guns. You had maybe 1 or 2, 3, 4 cases that would come through your door maybe a week as a defense attorney with an individual with guns. Now you hardly have anybody being arrested with drugs, substantial amount of drugs, and everybody's getting arrested with handguns. One of the things you kind of also know is that everybody is carrying guns. And so you're carrying guns. Why are they carrying guns? One, sometimes they want to say protection. Okay, I hear that. But also what you do have a lot of individuals with impulse control disorder and issues, and they get angry, they get upset, boom, they pull out their gun, they're shooting individuals. And so what I can also tell you, because having been on both sides, I think I look at things a little differently sometimes because I was also did a lot of federal CJA work, and federal CJA work is when you represent federal defendants in the federal side. I would have a gentleman with a gun case in Baltimore City. It would be on videotape, body camera, with the gun in their hand. And they want to go to trial. Hey, you know, you're facing 5 years about the possibility of parole. You have a previous felony. I can get you 2 years, 3 years. We're going to trial. The second the federal government picked up that case, they would cry and beg me to see if I get them 7 to 10. And so what I realized, there was a mentality, i.e. we're going to hold you accountable because the laws just tend to be a little more stiffer. Now, I'm saying that everybody doesn't necessarily deserve it. You look at a case-by-case basis. There's a difference between a person having a gun in their house and say they have a prior felony. It's a 40-year-old individual and the gun is in their safe and the felony's from 1990. That's a lot different individual than a kid who's riding around a vehicle or car who's 21 years of age that's already beat 3 handgun cases. That young man, we have to say, we have to teach you a lesson. We have to hold you accountable. So I do believe in accountability first and foremost. And what I'm saying is that I just want to have a little more oomph when holding you accountable so that we can let you know that we're really not playing. Okay.
I appreciate you coming here, and I just want to go on the record saying I really applaud your efforts and this new focused responsibility on and the embracing the idea that people need to be held accountable for their actions. You know, it was very encouraging, and I'll just share this with you, especially yesterday. I was at the Martin Luther King parade during the day. There was a lot of activity. There was a lot of people there along both sides. And I was on the side near Poppleton, okay? And a lot of people in Poppleton, if you know Poppleton, and Commissioner, you know Poppleton, right? There's a lot of handgun issues, a lot of shootings in that area of West Baltimore. And there was people discussing, when you walked by, about you and your stance on this gun control. Because even prior to that, minutes prior, there was an elderly lady that came up to me and she shared that she's like, I'm standing by you because I need to be able to look over. I want to make sure that, you know, nobody comes up behind me from up the street, because she was worried about her safety, but she wanted to come enjoy the festivities. So she felt more, but they commented as you went by about he's going to make these positive changes. He's going to take them to trial. He's going to do these things. So I just want you to know, and I know you've probably heard it, but I want you to know that as someone that heard it on the streets of Baltimore, that people appreciate that vigor that you're bringing and holding people accountable. Commissioner, they appreciate what you guys are doing and trying to, you know, hold and make these arrests and investigate the crimes, because it's meaningful to them every day, because they're there seeing this stuff. So, and I'll finish my question. Isn't that true? Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Senator. Yes, it is. Thank you. Yeah. Well, still one more, so I don't know.
States, you didn't mention why there was a difference in treatment between the 18 and 20-year-old and those over 21. Was it a mere accident and it needs to be cleaned up, or did you uncover any history to why they would be treated differently and why you want them to have parity there?
I really didn't, to be honest. I suspect that they wanted to go ahead and have younger people face a stiffer penalty in hopes that it would be somewhat of a deterrent. But I also feel like this, why are we, just look at the fine alone. Why are we asking for a young person who barely can have makes anything on a job? Why are you asking for a $10,000 fine, but you're not asking a person over 21 who may actually have a job paying a little bit more? You're only asking a maximum $2,500 fine. So for me, I think parity is very, very, very important. To me, it's one of the most important aspects in looking at the change. It must be uniform across the bridge for everybody. I do also recognize that, and one of the things I also talk about is just because you have the conviction doesn't mean first-time offender, and I've talked about this, doesn't mean I'm going to throw you away. Because I do recognize having a wear, carry, and transport gun conviction is quote-unquote a scarlet letter. But I also think now we have the opportunity to have you get the services, i.e., one of the things I found out from a lot of my younger clients as a defense attorney, they could barely read and write. So now we can go ahead and put you in the educational system to get you the GED services that you need to go ahead and wraparound services. We can put them and we can work with someone such as MONSE to give you those services. And guess what? If you're able to stay out of trouble for the time period, then we can always bring you back. It was called a motion for modification. You have 5 years from the date, the time period that they've been placed on probation. If you're doing what you're supposed to, we can give you a probation before judgment allows you to expunge your record. But this way, the court has at least enough to hang over their head to say, do what you need to do, or, and if you're successful, we can go ahead and help you expunge your record.
Well, it would be helpful for me just to know why there is a difference, because I think before we change a law, we ought to understand why it was different to begin with. It may have been an accident, may have been an oversight, but there may have been some intentionality, and I would like to know it. You can certainly tell us that intentional purpose is no longer valid or was never valid. So that's that. The last thing I want to ask is, this briefing is trends and efforts to combat gun violence, and I know other people are speaking. But you brought up some, extraordinary numbers of homicides in Baltimore. Is this this change you're bringing today, is that the key to helping bring down gun violence, or do you have other legislative initiatives that you are bringing here? That's, I'm talking about what you can do in Baltimore City. Are there other things you want to do other than this one particular bill this session to deal with the unprecedented violence in Baltimore?
Well, for me, I'm, as we all know, a rookie. So I figure I'd start slow, figure out how the system works. But this, to me, is very important. And the reason, to me, I say it's so important is because, and I know I keep harping about my criminal defense days, but that's why I'm bringing it, because my criminal defense clients would say, oh, it's 3 years, fine. I'll go, and I'm going to get 25%. I don't have to do 25%. Yeah, I'll do 3 years on my head, because it's such a small amount of jail time. And so one of the things I do know is that when I wrote my prosecution plan, I looked at from the work that I did right here. And it have to have certainty of consequences, and I'm all for the certainty of consequences. But what I also realized, the defense attorney showed me that it's not just a certainty of consequences, but it was also saying, you know what, some of these consequences could potentially have the opportunity to be a little more severe. And so when I took those two, I realized for me this was important. Focusing on guns, guns, guns. We all campaign. We all do various different types of campaigns. I knocked on 15,000 doors. Everything they wanted to talk about were guns, 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 illegal guns, illegal guns, illegal guns. And I wanted to bring something to me that I felt was super important to begin to have the fight against illegal guns. But I also recognize in terms of the other bills and other legislation, I'd like to take my time to have a better understanding, because how some bills may impact the community, I want to make sure I take the time to really figure that out. So this was the only bill that I was concerned about from my standpoint. Other bills other people may have that I may want to be a part of, but this was the bill for me that when I spoke to people, the citizens of Baltimore City really said, hold people accountable for these handguns, and they just got tired of watching them come in and out of jail that quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just for clarity's sake, this is your policy, this is the policy that you're attempting to enact, but is there current legislation?
No, there isn't.
Do you have someone that's going to be a sponsor of this legislation?
Not now, but I'm working on it.
Okay, thank you.
And just to advise you, this Friday's the deadline for getting bills to the drafting people and legislative services so that they will get the bills back to us before we have to file, before the deadline for filing them. So if you're thinking about working on it, work fast.
Well, the Maryland States Attorney Association, Mr. Kroll, we've been working. I know he's been talking. He's been doing a lot of that work already. So it just isn't me jumping up here on my own, but I've been working on something we've already spoken to. We've spoken on the House side as well, so I did want to come here today and present this, but yes, we will be working on that as well.
Terrific. More power to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I just had one quick question, sorry.
Yes, sir.
No, I appreciate you spoke a little bit about the kind of the pre and post 2015 or Freddie Gray kind of time frame of when people were carrying more firearms. Can you expound on that a little bit more? Can you just dig a little bit deeper if you're comfortable? I mean,
No, I am.
Yeah.
Well, you know, a lot changed in Baltimore City because prior to 2015, what I saw was a lot of cases that would come to me were drug cases, CDS possession cases. Then after Freddie Gray, the death of Freddie Gray, I think with the police department at that time period not necessarily being as proactive in policing, the number of individuals began to carry guns. I think in carrying the guns, then you began to slowly see the change in the culture where it had to be, i.e., I'd rather be carried by 6 than judged by 12. And so, I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6 is what the mentality began to be. And so then you just got to a point where we could do whatever we wanted to in the community. Do I think that also played a role in the non-prosecution of lower level offenses and quality of life crimes and things like that, where you began to see people feeling that they needed to go ahead and just carry the gun? You see a lot of times some of the younger people would carry guns just in case. And so then you began to see individuals carrying guns that had not been properly trained in guns. They'd be angry, they'd be upset. Beforehand, if you had a gun, the gun may be the neighborhood gun, and it may be on a tire, inside of a tire in a vehicle. It may be in an abandoned house. It may be at someone's girlfriend's house who lives on the block. And before you'd have an argument, that individual would have to run, go get the gun, and that other person would have left, and so that you didn't have the shooting. Now if the person already has the gun on them, they get angry, they pull it, boom, you have a shooting a lot quicker. So for me, those are things that I've seen that I believe have contributed greatly to the number of homicides we have had in Baltimore City, the easier access to illegal handguns, and not really fearing the consequences or the penalties that illegal handgun ownership has.
No, I appreciate it, and obviously this is not a Baltimore City-centric problem. This is in my district and in the entire state and throughout the nation.
Yes.
So I appreciate you taking the time to come here. We want to move on with the panel, so I'm going to just put
thank
this.
you.
I'm just going to say this, and then I'll kind of plant this, and then just we can move on. But obviously you're in a. I don't need to tell you this. You're in a position of prominence, and you have a platform that you can provide real leadership on public safety issues, not even in the city, but also throughout Maryland. And I guess, we all focus a lot on the kind of the short, we've got some short-term issues, and then there are long-term strategic issues to address. And, I saw that you stood up with the commissioner and with the mayor, and we're talking more about some of the short-term things, and I think it's important for us to all think about kind of the difference between short and long-term and how they both work in concert with each other. But it would be, we'll stick a pin in this, but I want to talk a little bit more in the future about kind of the comprehensive approach that, the mayor, the commissioner, and you are thinking about as you move forward, because, we're going to be undertaking a lot of public safety issues as we move forward in the session. So I'll put a pin in it now, but, I want to continue that dialogue.
Yes, sir.
Mr.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Excellent. Mr. Commissioner.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Vice Chairman Wallstreicher, and good afternoon to members of the committee. Without a doubt, 2022 was a very challenging year for our police department and for our entire city. In the midst of these challenges, I, along with every member of the Baltimore Police Department, wake up every day committed to reducing violent crime and building a safer Baltimore with both urgency and tenacity. And despite these challenges, the members of our department go out each day to serve and protect, investigating incidents, making arrests, walking patrols in our community, conducting business checks, and working to create better community policing relationships. Last year, we rolled out many innovative and creative strategies to address violent crime, optimize our limited resources, and make progress in our implementation of the federally mandated consent decree. Operationally speaking, arrests were up 10% compared to the previous year, making 2022 the first year since 2010 that arrests were up. This includes more gun arrests, 1,668, which were up 20%. More guns were taken off of Baltimore streets, 2,653, making gun seizures up 14%, and then ghost guns and ghost seizures were up by more than 40%. Last year, our officers seized 485 ghost guns, which we continue to find in the hands of young people and those prohibited from possessing a weapon. We also served more than 2,200 warrants, which is up by more than 22%, thanks in large part to additional state funding from our state delegation, the General Assembly, and the governor. And all of this is happening with a greatly reduced workforce. However, despite our increased outputs, we're not reaching our desired outcomes. Our officers are making good, strong cases and arresting violent offenders only to have them released and reoffend. Last year, we arrested more than 200 suspects for homicide and non-fatal shootings. 74% of these suspects have prior arrest records, with one individual being arrested 68 times, others 44 times, 34 times, and 26 times respectively. And it also works the other way. We had an individual who had previously been given a life sentence only to later be murdered on the streets of Baltimore. So this situation is untenable and leaves criminals emboldened because they believe they lack the certainty of consequences for their choices. Simultaneously, it leaves the public feeling as though we don't care about what is happening and that we're not doing our jobs, which couldn't be further from the truth. Can BPD perform better? Absolutely, and I would never suggest otherwise. There is always room for improvement. Our department remains relentless and continues to adapt and work to support our communities while removing violent offenders from our streets. However, the police are but one leg of the stool and only one part of the crime fight. We collectively, meaning police, prosecutors, probation and parole, courts and corrections, need to improve the criminal justice system, how we better work together, how we better communicate, and have better interoperability to improve outcomes. Any operation requires teamwork through coordination, communication, and collaboration. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is not happening. Since my first day in Baltimore, I knew that more needed to be done to strengthen and maximize our partnerships, and this is exactly what has been done. We have more than 50 Baltimore Police Department personnel who work and are duly commissioned to work alongside all of our federal law enforcement agencies, focusing on violent crime to include gun violence, drug and gun trafficking, and organized crime in Baltimore. Together with our federal partners, we investigated 50 cases last year, federally indicted hundreds of individuals, and made more than 300 arrests. Each month, we host coordination meetings with representatives from each federal agency to break down ongoing investigations and discuss how each agency is working together to remove some of our most violent offenders from our streets. We continue to work closely with both our state and local partners in facilitating multi-agency collaboration, including warrant initiatives, regional task forces, and investigative and analytical assistance when needed. This includes our partnerships with the State Police, Department of Public Safety and Corrections, Probation and Parole, the Department of Juvenile Services, and Social Services. And even though there are periodic changes among our partners, we continue to move forward in strengthening our partnerships. Sheriff Colgan and I met last month and has made the offer to supplement our staffing with its deputies to assist whenever and wherever they are able. It was an offer that I not only happily accepted, but have already taken him up on. Just last week, my executive team and I met with State's Attorney Bates and his leadership team to open the lines of communication for better coordination and collaboration. We look forward to integrating his senior team into these coordination efforts. I am proud of the BPD's ability to secure strong participation from federal, state, and local partners, as each of them is a core part of our strategy in reducing and preventing violence and disrupting crime trends. But we all know that enforcement is more than just the police intervention or police arrest. It is the entire strategy that includes police interaction up to arrest, prosecution up to the conviction, incarceration and corrections to lead to rehabilitation, which altogether is the definition of enforcement. For many years, the burden to reduce crime has only sat on the shoulders of officers making arrests, but we know that that path to comprehensively reducing violent crime must include prevention, intervention, enforcement, rehabilitation, and reentry. We work closely with Director Jackson and the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety Engagement in not only co-producing public safety strategies with our communities, but also working on prevention through trauma-informing the holistic approach. The Group Violence Reduction Strategy, which you'll hear more about, was rolled out in January of 2022, and we now have seen a 34% reduction in homicides and non-fatal shootings in our most historically violent district, the Western District. Now, while many may question why these reductions didn't impact violence across the entire city, we know through the work of our technical partners that we could have seen homicides and non-fatal shootings increase more than 5% if not for GVRS being implemented. This strategy involves the intentional approach of cross-collaboration between our department, social service providers, and community members, in which we all work together to reach those who most want to be a part of the solution and provide them with service and pathways to give them a life and pathway away from violent crime. Accepting help is not a requirement. Reducing violence is. I have both confidence and optimism in this strategy, and that the expansion into the Southwestern District, then Central District, this quarter, and then eventually to all of our districts is going to prove fruitful. In addition to the work of GVRS, the department is using national best practices in addressing both the people-based and place-based strategies. We're using data like never before, identifying where we should be deployed, but also with whom we should be focusing and making good cases. As we enhance the focus of where and who we are focusing on, we must ensure that our officers have the right tools to make ethical, lawful decisions on how we make arrests. Every member of our department has been trained on the national best practices of stops, searches, and arrests. And we believe this training has significantly attributed to our officers making more arrests, even gun arrests, even with the greatly reduced police force. And in doing so, we are also seeing complaints from the public decrease by more than 30% this year, while all the arrests have increased. We know that ending violent crime is a shared responsibility, and while our officers are doing the work of arresting individuals, we must continue to ensure that there are both swift and, more importantly, certainty of consequences for those wreaking havoc in our communities and neighborhoods. Together with our new state's attorney, our new sheriff, our mayor, the Director Jackson of the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety Engagement, and all of our federal, state, and local partners, we must send a strong message that we are united, and together we will build a safer and stronger Baltimore. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you and for listening, and at this time, I'll welcome any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Harrison. You heard kind of the beginning of my question. I just would ask if you could possibly elaborate. You did just talk about all of the efforts where you're working to collaborate with federal partners and others, but, for a long time now, I've questioned, and even this committee and this body have passed legislation to require the reporting on tracking in terms of how often the original source of these illegal guns are found. And I'm truly concerned and curious to know how are your efforts in terms of oversight, inspecting, investigating large volume dealers, gun shops, those that are responsible for the mass amounts of guns, not just one or two illegal guns on the street, but hundreds, if not thousands. What efforts are you making? Can you speak to any results or progress there? And how can we help legislatively, if at all, with that?
I can absolutely answer that question. Happy to. A couple of things. There is no such thing as little guns on the street because the smallest gun can kill a person. The smallest bullet can kill. And so we see it very differently. But yes, because of that, we are as concerned, if not more concerned, about where guns are coming from. To that point, we have a number of officers, the detectives rather, working with ATF who are dual commissioned and have dual authority to go anywhere in the country because our jurisdiction as a Baltimore police officer stops at the city line. But they work with ATF and can go anywhere and track those weapons anywhere in the country, which they do. But we wanted to make sure we built that capacity internally. And I have two officers, the detectives, who actually are in a unit called the Firearms Intelligence Unit, who are assigned at the U.S. Attorney's Office, who are under the supervision of the U.S. Attorney to help do that, to track those guns and to do this work so that not only knowing but hold people accountable who are bringing guns into the city unlawfully. Baltimore City has no gun stores. We know about half of the guns we see come from outside of the city but within the state, and the other 50% come from the other 49 states. And so we have to do something about them coming into the city. But we want to make sure that we're clear, and I echo what the state's attorney said, that these young folk, or even the older individuals, and because years ago the average age of the person committing violent crime was between 16 and 24. Now the average age of the individual is 30. And so we're working with both those dynamics. I will say this. We want to make sure that we can deter people from carrying guns because this, and I welcome any criminologists. I know Dr. Webster's a criminologist. I am one, and I join all the others around the country who know that the same demographic of individuals caught carrying an illegal gun is the same demographic who end up being victims of shootings and murders, and is the same demographic of individuals who commit shootings and murders. So it's not a different set of people. So I don't want to minimize the individual carrying the gun because I've said this in this very chamber from year to year. The decision to pull the trigger is not made when the trigger is pulled. The decision to pull the trigger is made when an individual puts his or her hand on the gun and walks out of their door. They have made up in their mind that if they need it, they have it. If they have it, they'll use it. So that's why we want to send a clear message to deter them from making that bad decision in the very first place.
I'll ask follow-up questions offline,
Yes.
Commissioner. I'll ask follow-up questions offline because I did also ask if you could speak to any specific results. But again,
I don't have any numbers about arrests or prosecutions. I can certainly get that to you in the follow-up with our officers who are working either at the U.S. Attorney's Office or at the ATF about people, origins of guns, and who's been identified and are held accountable. But we can get that to you in a follow-up.
Before switch over to Senator Folden, I just said to you, I really, what Senator Carter has been saying today has really resonated with me. It's something that we've been working on all summer, just in terms of trying to get the information of where the guns are coming, where the illegal guns are coming from. And it's been hard for us to do that because I think DOJ said that, just a lot of that information is using concurrent investigations, so they won't give it to us. Do you know, how are we as a legislative body supposed to make informed decisions if we don't know what the data really tell us? And so if you could give us.
We do have that data. I just don't have it in front
I
of
would
me,
love
but
to have it. Yeah. Now I'm not going to get you in trouble with DOJ.
We can tell you that somewhere around 50% come from other areas outside of the city but within the state. And then we have about 50% of what we seize that we know of come from the other 49 states. And then there's what we don't know about all the guns that are on the street that we don't yet know about. What is an interesting dynamic is the increase in ghost guns, or what they call homemade firearms. And we had over 480 come in just this year. We started 4 years ago, it was just 9. It has incrementally and exponentially increased year over year. We served the search warrant just a few weeks back where a person had over 20 of them in his house and had the parts hanging from the Christmas tree as decoration. And those firearms do not have serial numbers. Anyone can buy one with a credit card or a gift card. So all anyone has to do is have enough money to buy the gift card, can order it, have it shipped to their home, can put it together in about an hour, and it cannot be traced. And so that is a very difficult dynamic that's exponentially increasing and making it worse for law enforcement.
Obviously, we wrote that bill right in back
Yes.
there in this room. So, you know, what impact, if any, has that? I mean, it just came online this year. So, has it had any sort of an impact?
It has some impact because we are making some arrests with individuals who are carrying ghost guns, and we are finding people who are having them shipped to their homes, like this warrant we did, where they are putting them together. I can get you the information. I don't have it with me if we know that those individuals have sold them or passed them on to others who then will have committed crimes with those guns. But because they're not serialized, we can't trace it back to any one owner. Only when we seize them can we hold that one person accountable for that gun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, I appreciate you coming out today. So I don't understand, I don't expect you to have full numbers on any of these questions, but I did want to point out, you know, we keep talking about today, you know, even the chairman was asking about where these illegal guns are coming from, illegal guns, where they're going, they're getting out on the street, ghost guns, where they're coming from, Do you have any breakdown, or can you get some breakdown in the future that shows the number of arrests you're doing with legal gun owners versus the illegal gun owners that you're dealing with each year?
We can get that to you. The majority of the arrests are guns that are illegally possessed, and they are not the lawful gun owner.
I would say it's probably an overwhelming majority. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's just something to kind of show. I mean, we're all about, I appreciate, again, responsible gun ownership, being accountable for your actions, the things that you guys are talking about. These are all really great things to do. But when you have that many illegal guns in a known high-density area, there are people that want to defend themselves, or at least be able to, legally. So, let me say it again. So there are some people.
Say it again.
Say it again. So I want to kind of just step over to just kind of like parallel, but it's concerning because I believe your current staffing levels, and I have to applaud the Baltimore Police Department. I mean, the current staffing levels you guys are working with, I mean, I'm hearing numbers that are commensurate with, you know, the same levels that you had 25 years ago at your current staffing levels on the street. That should be concerning to anybody that lives or even visits Baltimore. You know, so I would like to see, or if I could get those numbers as well sometime, Commissioner, to see what your current staffing levels are, what you're allocated, because it goes over to my next question, which is, because of the recent MPAA that was passed, have you seen an increase in departures from your department?
We haven't seen an increase in departures. The departures are about the same. Now,
Okay.
one year we had an exponentially large number of departures, but that was because there were a number of medical separations.
Okay.
That people came upon a
Sure.
timeline where they had to separate.
Right.
The departures have remained constant over about a 12-year period now. The majority of them are retirements. There are a number of resignations, but we have that. I can get someone to answer that question in just a second, but I'm budgeted for 2606 sworn.
Okay.
I have 2142 actual.
Okay.
So that's a difference of about, what, 464, something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, 26?
I'm budgeted for 2606.
Uh-huh.
And I have 2142.
Yes. Okay. All right, well, just a little bit better than where I was told you were at, but that's good. Because that always spins off into the safety of your officers. Again, having to deal with these violent offenders, they never know what they're coming up against, and quite honestly, some people are probably not as concerned about whether the person is a police officer or not coming towards them to arrest them, that they're just going to respond instinctively like you're commenting about. They've already made that decision should the need arise, and they may feel that that's the time. That's the concerning part, because that then chips away at erodes the very expectation, I guess, that we would have as citizens, that our protectors are able to protect us when we're actually putting them in harm's way quite in quite many ways. I'll just leave it at that. And then the last thing I have, sir, is what about the nuisance crimes? These are things that people will comment about. I know a few years back, we had the thing about, we were talking about illegal, that they were going to ban the dirt bikes in the city limits. So people that wanted to legally live in the city and wanted to take their kids out to Western Maryland or something, they weren't allowed to have a dirt bike, even though they'd have a title or whatever, or a certificate of origin. But the bill seemed to be crafted at the time that it was kind of like, oh, we're going to make this legislation and this law that these bikes are banned in the city, so somehow they'll just disappear. When in actuality, if you ride through the city for any amount of time at all, you're going to come across in some certain pockets people running literally up all 4 lanes of the road on dirt bikes, pulling wheelies and on ATVs, and they'll go right by police officers, and there's no recourse. I mean, the police officers aren't going to chase them. It's just not, it's not a violation to their degree worth jeopardizing their career. So you have that, and you have some other nuisance crimes. So I'm just curious as to how we're moving forward, because those things lead into the other parts, and this is a side issue. You don't have to answer right now. I just wanted to point out that these are concerns that I hear about, and would like to have that discussion on these strategies so that we can figure this out.
The simple answer, without going too in-depth, the simple answer is we had to adjust policy because of a previous prosecutorial policy about minor offenses.
Okay.
I think having heard from our new state's attorney, who will be doing things a lot differently, we will have to adjust policy. But right now, we've done that, and we're now working on training on how to enforce, because every crime does not result or should result in an arrest.
Correct.
Which of the nuisance offenses, if I may repeat you, warrant a warning at the first encounter? Which of them warrant a citation, and which of them warrant a physical arrest, and in what progression do we do that?
Sure.
So that's what we're working on right now, but it is something that, based on the new administration, our department is training and preparing for some type of different enforcement.
Well, that's outstanding to hear, and I applaud your efforts. I applaud the state's attorney coming in and having that, hearing that those concerns. It becomes the tip of the spear of your concerns, and that's the way you're going to forge ahead. And so I appreciate y'all coming out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Harrison, just a quick
Yes.
follow-up on something that you said in response to the chairman. The person you recently arrested with the 20 ghost guns and different parts, from your intelligence, was that a person that was just having them for his own personal use, or were you able to discover that that person was selling those guns or had them for the purpose of selling them?
Well, I don't have the information about that person's criminal history, but we caught the person in a search warrant with fully made guns and some that were in preparation to build out to be operational guns, 20 of them inside of his home and hanging from the Christmas tree. What we're working now to try to ascertain is, did he purchase them and had them shipped to his home? What we know is that inside his home, he was putting them together. And so that is the concern for ghost guns, trying to track where they came from, who would have been the person to purchase them. Was it him, or was it somebody else that either sold them or gave them to him? But he was actually putting them together. And what his intent was to distribute them across the city, in what way and to whom. Those are things that are being worked on right now in partnership with the state's attorney and now with the U.S. attorney, because this has a high probability of being prosecuted federally.
Thank you. Really quickly, I just imagine that it's extremely difficult to track something like that, the original source, the seller, from so many different, buying different parts and trying to track it down. But have you been able to do that in any of these cases?
I don't have the answer for you as I stand right now. What we can say is when we seize a ghost gun or a handmade firearm, without the serial number, unless the person confesses to either buying it directly from the manufacturer who sold it, had it shipped to their home, unless they confess to buying it on the black market, on the street from somewhere else, that is the problem. We don't know. Thank you.
Excellent. Seeing no further questions from the committee, we'll move on. Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Jackson, I think are you up next? And are you pulling up a presentation?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay, you're good. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Vice Chair Wallstreicher, members of the committee, thanks for having me today. For those that don't know me, my name is Shantae Jackson, and I have served as the Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement in Baltimore City since January of 2021, shortly after Mayor Scott took office. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to this committee today on gun violence trends in Baltimore City and to share with you the role that MONSE plays in making sure that we are stemming the tide of gun violence in our city while simultaneously unearthing its root causes. Our office partners with the folks who are sitting on this panel with me today, also with community-based organizations with the goal of co-producing public safety through a lens of public health. Gun violence prevention, victim services, and community engagement and opportunity make up the MONSE portfolio, and as a result, span violence prevention, intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry. The chair mentioned a couple of moments ago that he was interested not only in understanding the work that we are doing in the short term, but also understanding the long-term approach with regard to this work. And I want to just be really clear in sharing that MONSE is responsible for the day-to-day strategic oversight and project management of the Group Violence Reduction Strategy, or GVRS. You heard my partner, the police commissioner, mention GVRS a few moments ago. This is just one of the mayor's dual gun violence prevention approaches. The other prong is community violence intervention, also known as CVI, and I'm going to be sharing more about our work in these areas over the course of my presentation. I know that you all have been sitting for some time today, so I'm hopeful that the introduction to a slideshow engages you. You'll also find out very quickly that I am a data geek and want to make sure that we are talking about both qualitative and quantitative measures when we talk about the trends. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, can you possibly put it to full screen or presentation mode just so we could see a little bit easier? If not, don't worry about it. We'll proceed. Don't worry. Don't let me mess up your flow.
Is this one it? Full screen mode?
There we go. Thank you.
Is that better? Yes. Great. Oops. Oh, right. So Baltimore has obviously had gun violence issues for decades. It's one of the reasons that Mayor Scott prioritized this as his top issue. It's also what led my agency, along with BPD, the state's attorney's office, and other partners to complete what we called a citywide problem analysis prior to launching the group violence reduction strategy pilot in the Western District. We wanted to understand who specifically was engaging in violence. For example, how old are they on average? What proportion of violence is group involved? And how much violence involves guns? So you can see from this slide that the Western District experienced the largest number of homicides and non-fatal shootings between 26 and 2020, which is the time period during which we did the problem analysis. This is why we selected this district as the pilot location for GVRS. 818 people were either shot or murdered by a gun in this 5-year period. This slide shows you the amount and the age ranges of victims and suspects in the Western District. Noticeably, what we learned, and the police commissioner alluded to this, is that most victims and suspects are around the same age groups. What you'll see here is that while we often talk about or hear narratives around the young people in Baltimore City driving the majority of the crime and the gun violence, in the Western District specifically, you'll see that folks between the ages of 25 and 34 actually drove 40% of the gun violence in that district, with folks between the ages of 16 and 24 accounting for about 31%. I'll also share with you here that we learned that about 88% of the homicides that were committed in the Western District were with a gun. So we're doing the work of enforcement here, and we've really started to see gains in this space in the Western District. We started to prepare the Southwestern District to do that same kind of work. Our problem analysis in looking at the Western told us that about 39% of the victims and the suspects in 2020 that were killed and or who committed a shooting had just been released from prison less than a year. This speaks directly not only to our need to make sure that we have the proper supervision as it relates to parole and probation, but we're also doing the necessary work of rehabilitation when folks are incarcerated. We've also done the work to uncover motives. We knew that about 70% of the cases that were reviewed in the Western District were group member involved. And for folks that don't understand what we mean when we say group member involved, I want to pause here for a second to make sure that we're differentiating a group from a gang. A gang is statutorily defined. A gang is more organized and, quite frankly, doesn't necessarily sit in a hyper-localized area within a community, but can spread all across a city, all across a jurisdiction, all across the country. You all have heard of the Bloods, the Crips, BGF, MS-13. Those are gangs. When we talk about groups, we're talking about social networks of individuals. Your crew. All of us have groups. Ideally, they're not violent. In Baltimore City, the ones that are the focus of the group violence reduction strategy. And so coming back to what I just mentioned here, this reference at the bottom of roughly 69.6%, and doing our analysis of the Western District, we discovered that about 70% of those shootings and homicides were group involved. That meant that we had to be really thoughtful about what the other 30% of the shootings' motives were. And so MONSE started to have those preliminary conversations about what our strategies need to be for the subset of crimes in our city that aren't group involved. It's precisely why you hear from our office and why you hear from the mayor that we've got to take a dual approach to gun violence. One that partners with law enforcement, GVRS, and the other, CBI, working together. This is a good example and a good demonstration of the work that we would do, for example, to prevent domestic violence related cases. That's something that would happen on the community violence intervention side, where we are paying attention to intervention opportunities and prevention opportunities associated with abuser intervention training, and things like that. So what you're seeing here, and I know this is a pretty busy slide, are our month-over-month comparisons. So 2021 versus 2022 in the Western District for homicides and non-fatal shootings. I want to draw your attention to the very last row here. It's where we ended the GVRS pilot in the Western District. We saw a 35% reduction in homicides, given the work that not just MONSE did, but that MONSE did in demonstrating that all-hands-on-deck approach with BPD, with the state's attorney's office, the AG's office, the USAO's office, and a whole host of other federal partners' offices, and a 34% reduction in non-fatal shootings year over year. Here I'm showing you what our plan for scale looks like. So this is the plan for scaling the strategy citywide from 2023 to 2024. We needed to take a couple of things into consideration here, and you're really looking at the strategy spanning from district to district across the city. This is an actual map of the city by neighborhood. We had to pay attention to which districts had group violence challenges, which ones shared interconnected group violence dynamics with our GVRS pilot district. How would we do the work of being intentional around not outstripping current capacities? I think that Senator Fulton just asked the commissioner about attrition rates, right? And so how do we make sure that we aren't outstripping those capacities? How are we making sure that we expand in ways that benefit the overall expansion plan? It also means that we had to consider the BPD technology that was available to us that we could leverage within each district, and that we had to consider the changing of the BPD district boundaries, because redistricting just happened in Baltimore City, or was just passed in Baltimore City and will be happening shortly. So you can see we'll be expanding from the Western District into the Southwestern District, followed by the Central and then the Eastern in 2023. We're also focused on making sure that we maintain the integrity of this model in partnership with BPD, the SAO, and our community-based partners, so that we can double down on the results that we're seeing in the Western District and expand these benefits across the city. Because what can't happen is we cannot lose the ground that we've gained. So this is a preliminary view of what we're seeing in the Southwestern District. This is where we're about to move to next. So using the new district boundary maps, we know that the Western District now ranks number 2 as being the most violent, and the Southwestern, given the redrawing of the lines, will become the most violent district based on gun violence distribution. You can see that 92% of the homicides through the time period that we evaluated were committed with guns. So this is an illustration of the mayor's dual integrated approach to gun violence. You can see from this Venn diagram that there are elements of community violence intervention that are embedded into the GVRS model, like intensive life coaching, wraparound supports, victim services, and community moral voice. You can also see what we consider as a part of the mayor's community violence intervention ecosystem, which MONSE is responsible for fostering through the establishment of partnerships, standard operating procedures, and overarching strategy. This includes outreach, conflict mediation, which you'll hear Dr. Webster talk about shortly, violence interruption, which includes Safe Streets, our flagship program, hospital-based responder programs, and so much more. So to quantify just one aspect of the life-saving work that we do across our 10 Safe Street sites, last year, our Safe Streets team members mediated 2,207 conflicts. What I can tell you is that depending on the location of the Safe Street site, there's anywhere between a 70% and a 90% chance that there's a gun on scene when they are navigating these conflicts. Imagine the number of non-fatal shootings or fatal shootings that would have happened without these. So here's an understanding of where we are as a city and where we're heading as a city as we build out the CVI ecosystem. Prior to Mayor Scott's administration, we had the 10 Safe Street sites, some loose partnerships with some hospital-based partners, and a contract with ROCA that really focused on folks who are 16 to 24 who've been criminal justice system involved. And now, thanks to Mayor Scott's ARPA allocation, we've been able to make and take advantage of additional violence prevention investments, technical assistance from the White House as a part of their CVI collaborative and newly established partnerships, as you see here. This is a more accurate, more holistic reflection of what a comprehensive strategy is going to look like. To illustrate the partnership in another way, what you're looking at in all these little Brady Bunch square boxes here is what the partnerships look like prior to Mayor Scott taking office and prior to my department really digging deep into forging a broader ecosystem. And here are some of the partnerships that we've been able to establish or that we're in the process of actively establishing. So in this same way, it's going to take more than policing alone to address the violence that we're seeing in our communities. It's going to take more than city government alone. This is what the mayor means when you hear him talking about an all-hands-on-deck approach. Just a few more slides here. So this is how our growing ecosystem looks on the map and the locations of our sites. This is actually available on Open Baltimore for folks who want to take a closer look. What I will share here is that we notice the same gaps that you notice. And so that's why we are doing the work of analyzing hotspots in partnership with BPD and making sure that we're intentional about growing where the CVI work and the GVRS work needs to happen. We do rely on partnerships with the state in addition to leveraging city general funds for CVI at the state level. You all are probably familiar with the Tyrone Ray Safe Streets Act. That's about $3.6 million annually to Safe Streets, and the Maryland Violence Intervention and Prevention Program, which provides about $3 million annually for the work. We're also really excited about Maryland's leadership in the Medicaid expansion work that is going to be happening for hospital violence intervention programming that passed just last session. And so as we think about accountability and how we get it right, it's also why we're focusing on stepping up our data collection and evaluation practices as an agency so that we can understand the true impact of the work that we're doing and that it's not just limited to law enforcement or crime metrics. And just the last few slides here. I think that's the last slide. So before I turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Webster here, just want to underscore what you heard from the state's attorney and from the police commissioner. It is absolutely a partnership, and intentionally so. As the director of the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, my agency's tasked with interagency coordination and making sure that we're doing the accountability work with other partners around the implementation of the Comprehensive Violence Prevention Plan. I take this work very seriously. I look forward to partnering with each of you, and I am happy to answer any questions that you all might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Jackson. If you know, because you said you're a data geek, and we see that from your amazing presentation. When you are do you have a breakdown of when you presented the $6 million, I think it was the Safe Streets, and then the $3 million, which is actually some legislation that we passed here as well, for that $3 million annually. Are you able at this point to ascertain, in terms of the money being expended, how it's being distributed within the programs? For example, how much of it is going to actually boots on the ground interventions versus administrative? Do you have that?
Yes, I don't have it handy, but I will say that coming into this office, because I am a data geek, making sure that we had streamlined budget templates that allowed me to be able to very clearly see where spending was happening at a staffing level, at a community engagement level, at a resourcing level was critically important to me, not just for the Safe Streets program, but for every single contract that my agency has with any community-based organization. Specifically thinking through the Tyrone Ray Safe Streets Act, $300,000 of the 3.6 is allocated across all 10 sites. The additional $600,000, and so for their operating costs, whether it's staffing, rent, community engagement, stipends and incentives for individuals, the balance of the $600,000 is spent administratively to support that work. So we'll be investing in school-based violence interruption this year as a part of that $600,000 in 3 schools in Baltimore City, the most violent schools in Baltimore City based on data that we've gotten from the school district and in partnership with them.
Do you know which those are? Are they high schools and middle
Yes,
schools?
they are high schools. They are Mervo High School, they are Carver High School, and Digital Harbor.
Thank you. And one other quick question just to follow up. So with the chart, huge number of partnerships, give you a lot of credit for that, or this administration a lot of credit for that. But I have heard throughout many years, not necessarily recently, but we all continue to hear that these kinds of partnerships, or some of the smaller community-based programs that are really on the ground, are unable to obtain funds and resources. So within some of these larger umbrella groups, are there opportunities for those kinds of groups to also avail themselves of these resources?
I appreciate that question. I would offer that this administration's done it a bit differently than others. So Mayor Scott's ARPA investment of $50 million into MONSE did allow us to open up grant opportunities for organizations that have never been funded before, and MONSE has awarded over $26 million and many of those organizations have been what we would consider grassroots, on-the-ground organizations, in an attempt to either have them expand capacity and/or to provide direct services to the folks that we know need it most around the prevention and intervention spaces. Some of those grants are one-year grants, some of them are multi-year grants. And we've also, under Mayor Scott's direction, been able to add additional funds to our general funds bucket to make sure that we're expanding that portfolio even more. I mean, a really good example of that is a recent allocation of $500,000 across 10 community-based organizations for social emotional development in Baltimore City Public Schools. $300,000 worth of grants going to community-based organizations who support victims of human trafficking, whether that's sex trafficking or labor trafficking. A lot of folks don't know that Baltimore ranks number 14 in the country with regard to human trafficking.
One other quick follow-up, sorry about that, but if I didn't lose my train of thought. When you talked about these, the money being distributed to a wider array of groups, I think that's wonderful. I'm wondering, is there any type of reporting or accountability mechanism to find out the results once those grants are made? What's working, what isn't, so you know where to go the next time?
Thank you for that question. Another new thing put in place since taking over this agency, and for folks who aren't familiar with the name MONSE, it's because it didn't exist prior to this administration. It was known as the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. Obviously, with a broadened and a deepened scope, we're looking at things a bit differently. One of the first things that I did was stand up a grant portal that accounts for, or allows us to account for, performance metrics that our grantees have to put in that are not just quantitative measures, but also qualitative measures, so that we can have conversations about results, outcomes, and impacts to folks' lives. A great example of that for the group violence reduction strategy isn't just, is this person a homicide victim? It is also, are they safe, alive, and free? And what does it mean to be safe? Have we connected them to resources, and if so, what resources? Are they engaging with a life coach? How many times a week are they engaging with a life coach? And what are the subjects of those conversations? Obviously anonymized to protect participants' information, but yes, we are absolutely tracking that level of data to make sure that when we have conversations, not just with you all, but also with partners at the local level, that we're able to truly justify the asks for additional funding.
Thank you very much. Mr. Commissioner, I know you have to get going, so there are no further questions for him. Welcome to get on with your duties. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I just had one question for Ms. Jackson, and then we had a briefing last week on just parole in Maryland, and so DPSCS came, and their director of data came through, and basically we asked the question about a corollary between parolees and kind of any sort of connection of recidivism and crime, and the numbers that they presented were impressive, but also showed that there was no correlation between that level of those folks that were under that level of supervision and kind of recidivism or crime. No significant correlation. So I don't want to put words in their mouth, but essentially it was a different narrative than I think a lot of us were used to. And then you said today, I mean, there was a slide today that said 39% of the folks that either were victims or had committed a gun, there you go, was less than 1 year after release. So we had parole, not probation numbers. I think Senator Sidnor and I were going to follow up with an additional request for information. But those two narratives seem to be an opposite of each other, and I wonder if you could help us understand why the twain never meet on this issue.
So I would offer, not having the full context
Yeah.
of the conversation that you had with parole and probation. I don't want to speculate around why the differences exist, but we'll share that what you're looking at here was a snapshot of homicides and non-fatal shootings in 2020 specifically, in which we were looking at the victimology and the persons of interest associated with this work and what their engagement with the criminal justice system looked like. And so what you're looking at right now is data that we can validate based on conviction rates and based on who we knew to be under supervision at that time.
Yeah, and Council also, murders and homicides, a victim. Yeah, got it. So yeah, I mean, there may not be as much of a difference. It's just interesting because we'll definitely get the information, because the information they provided was pretty good. I mean, so. All right, excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time today. Thank you. Dr. Webster, welcome again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do you mind if she's going to come up and just grab the presentation
sure.
off there, so.
Hi, good afternoon. Again, my name's Daniel Webster. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins. And as I said earlier, I want to make clear that I'm here to share my own research and expertise. I'm not here with issuing any position for Johns Hopkins University, where I work. In my 30-plus years studying gun violence, a lot of it is focused, not surprisingly, on Baltimore, where we're based. What I want to do today is briefly share what we've learned evaluating safe streets, for one, a few words about GVRS, the Gun Violence Reduction Strategy, and then talk a little bit about gun law enforcement questions and issues that we've also studied. So, safe streets first came to Baltimore in a handful of neighborhoods between 2007 and 2008. We published our first study looking at the first 4 neighborhoods, contrasting gun violence rates before and after versus similar neighborhoods that didn't receive Safe Streets. We found statistically significant reductions in at least one measure of gun violence in 3 of the 4 through the end of 2010. Very encouraging findings for sure. Separately, we also did some work surveying program participants, understanding how the program has helped them, and also found in some street surveys of youth some change in attitudes relevant to, basically resorting to guns being less legitimate in places where Safe Streets was operating. So those were very encouraging. We then published a study in January of 2018 that looked at over a much longer period through the end of 2017 with many more sites. And unfortunately, those findings were less encouraging. We didn't see clear program effects that in some areas that had previously shown reductions, that those reductions had attenuated. And then we published a separate study with a different statistical technique, but basically the same data confirming that same conclusion, basically, of eroding effects over that time span. We have since engaged in additional research, actually funded through from state funds through MONSE, to evaluate in part the effects of Safe Streets more recently. So our current study that we're going to release formally at the end of this month has more encouraging findings. I'm going to just give you some overview comments about it because I'm going to be briefing city administration and the workers themselves before I do a public release, out of respect, of course. So in our most recent work, we, as Director Jackson mentioned, there are now 10 sites to look at data for. We also had another site involved in our analysis that was up and then discontinued in Mondawmin. So the overview of that is, on average, we found about a 20% reduction in shootings, non-fatal shootings and homicides across all the years and sites. This is an average. But importantly, we did see notable variation over time and place of how strong or lack of effects were going on. To put that 20% into context, it translates into an average Safe Street site over a course of a year is preventing about 1 homicide and 2 non-fatal shootings per year. Given the high cost of gun violence, the return on investment is quite impressive. I also, because I study this broadly, but besides Baltimore, I recognize that Safe Streets for much of its existence has been a relatively bare bones type of community violence intervention, principally focused on reaching the highest risk individuals and mediating conflicts to prevent shootings. Over much of the program's existence, meaningful resources to change the conditions of the lives and what's going on in those individuals has often not been there. So I'm hopeful and encouraged that we will move in the direction of more resourced and integrating some of these other programs and initiatives so that our violence interruptions team, their work is easier. Frankly, the other thing I do want to note that over this span of time, worker pay has been pretty low and training not always what it should be. So again, I'm hopeful in more current and in the coming months, attention to workers, their pay, their mental health, all of those things are addressed because they are the key. They are the key. You have to get and support good people to do this work. Just a comment about group violence reduction strategy. I've been briefed prior to this, showing the data, which are very encouraging. And this is a very evidence-based strategy that has worked in a lot of places. But I also will say it has not worked in all places, and it's very hard to do right. It really takes resources, coordination, cooperation, and I'm so encouraged to see what's going on now in Baltimore, because prior efforts at this same strategy did not yield reductions that we're seeing now. So that's very encouraging. I want to end talking a little bit about the work that we've done looking at gun law enforcement. The same studies that we've been doing to track neighborhood-level rates of gun violence across Baltimore and the effects of safe streets, we're also looking at what law enforcement initiatives have been put in place in certain times and places. A key takeaway as it relates to gun law enforcement is that less focused arrest for illegal gun possession, we can't correlate a clear connection between more of those and less violence. Conversely, when we see very focused attention on hotspots of shootings, we've documented 13% reductions in homicides and about 19% reductions in non-fatal shootings. So we published a report in 2020 that drew upon not only that research, but research from other cities, as well as new data that we collected from surveys and focus groups of residents in neighborhoods most impacted by gun violence, to understand what their experiences and, frankly, what they wanted as it related to law enforcement, gun laws enforcement. There were 13 specific findings, 8 specific recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of those. I'll spare you those. But we have a report that you can access. I will highlight a few takeaways from the report. One was, in terms of recommendations, aside from the need to be highly focused and intelligence-driven in our gun law enforcement practices, that we also needed to identify or create policies and practices to identify and correct illegal stops and searches. While we have documented public safety benefits of focused gun law enforcement, anybody who's paying any attention to what happened with the Gun Trace Task Force realizes that you can create great harms without appropriate measures of accountability for that really important part of public safety work. So our recommendation was to have very formal processes to assess these arrest practices to make sure that you are identifying any problems and correcting them because we've seen the great harms from failure to do that. Excuse me, sort of echoing really what State's Attorney Bates and Commissioner Harrison, the evidence is that certainty of consequences for illegal possession is really key here, and that has not always been the case in Baltimore City. I will note that mandatory minimums, as I indicated earlier, mandatory minimums, we don't have the evidence that they are effective in reducing violence, but more certainty and consequences does have beneficial, clear deterrent effects. Finally, I'll end on this recommendation that we felt that a lot of people are getting arrested with illegal guns, and aside from sort of the punitive consequences of that, that there really was a great need for behavioral interventions. And to me, what we were just talking about, the issue of people getting out of prison and then very quickly being involved in gun violence, these dots are all things that we can connect. And so I think a real commitment to making sure that you have strong social behavioral interventions with gun offenders, because eventually, again, they are going to come out of prison, that will yield great benefits, and I hope it receives attention from both state and city officials.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sticking with us this afternoon. Turn to the committee for questions. I've got a couple I'll ask offline, but opportunity for the committee. It's been a long day, so we appreciate, thank you very much. This has been tremendously helpful, and Director Jackson, thank you it's good to see you again, and thank you for coming down. It's a really great presentation, and we'll be in touch. All right, with that, that'll end our briefings for the day. Have a good evening.